Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Okay, welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
Nice to be with you this week. This week we're going to talk about something that comes up very often when I speak places. And that is, how do we warn people about wolves? It's one thing to warn people for people who are on the sex offender registry. It's another thing to warn people about people who never made it to the sex offender registry, but yet you know that they're very dangerous people, that they're dangerous to children, or they're dangerous to abusive to adults. How do we warn people? How do we warn the church? Do we use their name when we warn them?
Jimmy, explain that just a little bit for our audience. I know you and I speak privately a lot, so we know we're on the same page. What you're talking about here is a predator who has done harm,
alleged harm,
that has not been proven guilty in a court of law.
Right.
Now, we know that to get to that point, there has to be so much concrete evidence, and often it's determined by a magistrate or judge even. You know, at that point, I hear often about children getting raped repeatedly, yet that person gets off on a
or gets custody of that child.
Gets custody of that child. So we're talking about these people that are known wolves, but have not been have not gone through the court system due to a series of sad things that our court system has too many loopholes. So.
Yeah. Well, I want to make a couple a couple really important points before we kind of delve into this. And the first is that it's incredibly rare for people who are guilty to get a conviction.
Absolutely.
It's very rare for somebody to get a conviction. So if we're waiting for the court of law to hand down a guilty plea, and to give a conviction to people who, in fact, are guilty, you may be waiting a lifetime.
Well, we're seeing this every single day where people come out and they name names of their molesters, of their abusers, and yet the court system, it can drag on for years or just die in the process.
Yeah, and there's a host of reasons for that. Right. I mean, it's not that our court system is broken or corrupt or anything like that, but our court system is overwhelmed.
Right.
Our justice system is completely overwhelmed. Sometimes there's just a lack of enough evidence to be able to prove these cases beyond reasonable doubt. You have a whole bunch of factors, and that's not really the purpose of this
but
podcast.
Just to lay the foundation for what we're talking about.
Right. So, that whole that whole argument that people are innocent until proven guilty, that's nonsense. I mean, sure, in the court of law, absolutely, they should always be innocent until proven guilty. But we're not in a court of law. We're in the church, or we're in the home, or we're in a place where we're able to observe people, and we have to make judgment calls about who is safe for our children to be around and who's not. And the way that we make judgment calls is we observe behavior. So that's point one. Point two is that there should be watchmen in every place, in every home, in every church, every organization, every school. there should be watchmen, people who are watchers, people who pay attention and have the gift of discernment. They're able to discern whether somebody is a safe person or not, which leads me to my next point. Not everybody should be a watchman for very good reason.
Oh, right.
There are some people who they're convinced that everybody's an abuser. And you have some people who are just paranoid. And paranoia is counterproductive to keeping all of us safe.
And you have some people, Jimmy, on the other end of the spectrum who are convinced
who think
that
nobody is.
Because they're friendly and they'll
they have
say,
the rose-tinted lenses
right,
that, everybody's good. They have a good heart. Some people just, quote unquote, mess up.
Right.
But deep down inside, they're good people.
I think you used a key word. The watchmen should be people of discernment.
Mm-hmm.
They need to have that wisdom and that inner ability to tell good from evil.
Well, and here's another point too, and I think this is important to establish right off the bat. Your leaders aren't necessarily the watchmen.
Right.
We have this idea that this notion that church leaders are the ones who are going to keep an eye on people in the church. Sometimes that works incredibly to everybody's disadvantage. But when we have these things that I harp on a lot, these blasted covenant agreements between known sex offenders, they're always between whom? The church leaders
right,
and the sex offender, and they're the only ones in the know. The entire congregation is kept blind, and I think that's dangerous. I think that's wildly dangerous.
I think it's dangerous. Think of, in our situation, the church leader was the molester, was the abuser.
And most often the abuser is the church leader.
Right. And people are, we do use tinted glasses through which we see, because we see the good only. Mm-hmm. We overlook those small indicators that say, whoa, there is something really wrong here.
Yeah.
So we do need those watchmen who are those people of discernment who can see that and point it out and say, hey, something's not right.
Well, I'll give a shout out too, because there is a good resource out there, and it's Steve Black. He's a friend of mine. And he has Ezekiel 33 Ministries, which is Ezekiel 33 is the Watchman on the Wall. Steve Black started this ministry because there's abuse is very personal to him within his own family, and Steve's story is Steve's story to tell. It's not mine to tell, but Steve and I have talked on the phone a lot, and he said, we need trained watchmen who are the lookers. They're the people who watch out for other people who don't know how to spot wolves. And I'm going to give a little bit of history on the watchmen in antiquity. So, all your major cities in antiquity had walls around the city. This was a defensive wall. And on that wall, you had these watchtowers that were built up super high, and they would place a watchman in each of these towers facing every direction outside of the city. They could see in all directions. And the watchman was not the warrior. They were not soldiers. They were not leaders. It was their job to just keep watch, to be vigilant. So anybody who was approaching the city, they would have to make a discernment call, a judgment call, using discernment, and they would have to decide, is somebody, the way that they're walking, the pace with which they're walking, what's in their arms, are they coming in peace, or are they coming to wage war? And they had to make that call.
Right. And in my mind, I have this visual picture of that. And they were the guards. Mm-hmm. They were, that was their sole job, their sole purpose. And
it was to inform.
Right.
They had to communicate with the king or with whoever it was, the king's men within the city, they would have to communicate. And so if somebody was coming to wage war against the city, before that convoy ever got to the city, the soldiers were already armed and ready to go.
I can think of so many illustrations in current day movies that we've seen of instances like that. I think of General Patton also, and I also think of our prison system, since I'm working directly in where we have the barbed wire, but we also have above that, we have people on the lookout.
Yeah, you have your watchtowers.
We have our watchtowers, and we have the vehicles that drive around 24 hours a day around the circumference of that prison. Their only job is to be looking out. That's it. They are the keepers. So, we can, even if we can't picture back in the day, we can use current day illustrations that we do have people.
And it's a vital job. It's not just our government throwing money out saying, well, wouldn't that be nice to provide jobs for people and have them drive around in a truck 24 hours a day around the outside of the prison?
And blizzards and whatnot. I have to drive past our
I see them all the time too.
Yeah. Going to work and coming home from work. That vehicle is always going, always. Now, they are protected by barbed wire, by multiple layers of...
there are 2 fences.
Oh, yes, yeah. And inside of the prison, there are so many locked doors, but still there is that guard watching at all times, 24/7.
Right.
So... Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to divert.
No, that's good.
It helps us get an idea of what these watchers are.
So, the Watchmen, they also, whether it's modern day or whether it was in antiquity, they had to know and distinguish and properly distinguish between somebody who's not a threat and somebody who is. And you and I are in and out of both of these prisons often. Right. Can you imagine if we got out of our car and we got surrounded at gunpoint by guards?
Right.
Yeah. They don't do it though.
No.
They know, and they can tell based on how we dress, how we walk, how fast we walk, how slow we walk. They know what to look
Jimmy, for. I have almost a mile to walk to where I get from where I park in the one prison to where I have to go. There are eyes that I didn't know existed that are watching me.
Oh, yeah.
My
you better
demeanor,
believe it.
The pace in which I walk, everything. And
they're highly trained.
Highly trained, yes. Yeah.
They're highly trained. They're good at what they do. And
they have to be.
Absolutely.
They have to be.
So, that's really important. And, my point is that we do a major disservice if we just assume that because we're in whatever building, whether it's a school, whether it's a public school, or whether it's a daycare, or whether it's church, or wherever it is, we do a major disservice if we just assume that because there aren't quote-unquote incidences that everybody in there is safe. And once you drop your kids off and send them on their merry way, that everybody's safe.
Right.
And you can look at the track record. I just looked in the last 2 weeks here in Pennsylvania that we know of. In the last 2 weeks, there were 2 teachers arrested for having sex with minor students. One was a 37 or 38-year-old woman who was having sex with 14-year-old students in a middle school. Right. Another was a male teacher. And I didn't read the story in depth to see what his problem was, but the one it's not Erie County, but it's one of the counties near Erie. Anyway, it was interesting because the article said, and this was just less than 2 weeks ago, this woman was arrested, and the article said it came on the same day that the FBI had sent warnings out to parents in that region saying that abuse among minor children is getting worse. And I thought, here we are in Pennsylvania, which is in the absolute epicenter of everything abuse in the nation. And we're supposed to be I mean, the safest place. We have the best laws and the best preventative measures for abuse. And it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And the reason is we're not taking a proper approach to it.
Right.
And it common sense tells you that we need watchers who are people highly trained who know how to identify threats.
Right.
And it's a select group of people, and every single organization needs to have them.
I remember you years back when we just went through our misery, so to speak, of finding out that your dad was an abuser. You saying those very words, that if only there had been people who were watching, if only.
Yeah,
if
none
only,
of us were watching.
How did it get past? Right, none of us. In retrospect, and I've written about it, there were indicators all along
Absolutely.
the
There
way.
always are. There always are. And when people say there aren't signs, that's nonsense. There are always signs.
But we were not trained to be watchers. We didn't know.
But with that said, that there are always signs, and I harp on this a lot when I do trainings, the quote-unquote red flag behavior for abuse, it's not effective. It's absolute, most of it is nonsense. And it's stuff like, well, an abuser could be anyone. That's not an indicator of abuse.
Not at all. No, that's not what either
if
of us
anything,
are talking
that
about.
makes it more confusing. That puts a big question mark over our head. And my point is, well, gee, thanks for narrowing that down for us. Right?
Yeah.
The other thing, there are people who migrate to positions where it's normalized to work with children. Okay, great. There are 71 million children age 17 and younger in the United States alone. Again, thanks for narrowing that down for us. That's not an indicator that somebody migrates to a position where it's normalized to work with kids. That's not an indicator of abuse. My wife would.
Right.
She would be red flag.
List. Yeah. Right. No.
That's
not what we're talking about.
Buys presents for kids to quote unquote groom them. The more I hear about this, the more nonsensical I think this is too. But yet it's been the common thing that's put out there. So everybody just accepts as fact. The reality is all of us buy presents for kids.
I'm big on
all
that.
Of us, I know, you're the worst.
I know, I'm terrible. I am.
Every time she comes to our house, she's got a bag full of presents. I'm not kidding either. Every time you come here,
it's just, I know.
You have the bag full of treats for the kids.
I do.
That's absolute nonsense. We all buy presents for kids. Are there some abusers who use that to quote unquote groom kids? Maybe a small percentage, but the reality is abusers buy presents for kids the same as all of us do. That doesn't mean that somebody's an abuser.
That's not a key indicator.
So, for my thing, I say that abusers have tells. Okay, there are certain tells that they have where they consciously or subconsciously do things, carry themselves in such a way, have certain looks that they give kids, the same way that the creepy guy, I've given this example recently at trainings. All of us have experienced seeing the creepy guy at the mall who physically undresses the teenage girl with his eyes.
Absolutely.
You cannot mistake that disgusting look that they give these
tilted head.
And the stare.
That stare.
Yeah.
Yes, that stare.
You can't mistake that look.
Absolutely.
And you can't confuse that with a benign, somebody who's just an observer. You and I are observers. We watch people. There's a radical difference between people who watch people and people who undress people.
An immense difference. And we do have an inner sense of being able to tell.
Absolutely. But here's the rub. Pedophiles have that same exact look for prepubescent children that these men have with the teenage girls in the shopping mall. It's the same exact look. It's the same way that they look at children. But the thing is, we don't expect people to be looking at minor children sexually, so we don't see it.
Right.
Unless we're trained to see it, we don't see it. But that is an absolute tell of an abuser. And my dad, he said, one time he said, I can walk into any room and I can tell if there's somebody like me within 30 seconds. And I asked him, well, how do you decide that? How do you know that? How do you know with such confidence that somebody's like you when you walk into another room? And he goes, easy. I watch their eyes. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that was, I look at how they're looking at the minor children. And are they looking the same way that that guy at the shopping mall? And think about that. That same exact look. And he said whenever he told me that, we can't not look at children that way because we're perverts. We can't.
I'm
not
shaking my head because living with this person and not seeing it disturbs me yet to this day. I needed, and I didn't have that discernment.
Yeah.
I needed it, but didn't have it. I needed a watcher.
Yeah.
Someone who did have that kind of discernment to warn me, to warn our household.
Yeah.
To warn the friends.
So what do we do with this?
Yeah.
And I think that's the applicable question. What do we do with it? Well, first of all, Ezekiel 33 is clear that if the watchmen fail to warn when they know that there's a threat, blood is on their hands.
Right.
They're guilty. The watchman is guilty.
Absolutely. Think about it.
If the guy driving around the prison sees a threat and doesn't get on his radio and doesn't warn people, and he just turns a blind eye to that threat, he's guilty.
He's guilty of the blood that is to be shed.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes.
Ezekiel 33 also says that if the watchman warns, if he blows the trumpet, if he warns people that a threat is coming and people don't heed that warning, the blood is on their hands now. Not the watchman's hands. The blood is on the hands of the people who didn't listen to the warning. So it's equally as important that people listen to discerning people whenever they warn about other people. And I see this often where people within churches have legitimate warnings that they give the churches, and usually they're giving it to the church leaders. But also, not as often, but it's still often enough, people in the congregation shut those watchmen down. And they say, well, so-and-so is they're a nice person, and I've never had any problem with them, and you're just being a gossip, and you're being a slanderer, and all this stuff. And so they shut down the watchman.
I'm nodding my head because even when the glaring facts are in front of some people, they refuse to see it. And that's where we get really into this muddy, dark water of not protecting those we need to protect.
Yeah. So here's my thing. I think it gets a little bit tricky when we name names, because you better make good and sure that the person who you're warning a group of people about is a credible threat. So it can't just be, well, I have a feeling that so-and-so isn't on the up and up.
Although, let me interject that often the trained watchman will have that feeling.
Yeah.
And we know that if your gut says something is wrong, most likely it is.
But that's where I want to give something that's concrete. And I'm actually giving a talk in August at a training event. And I'm going to talk about the tells of an abuser.
Which that's going to be powerful.
So, it has to be something that we can, some hooks that we can hang the hat on and actually give a skeleton to this where we can say, okay, it's not just that I had a gut feeling.
Right,
but I had a gut feeling. Something was tipping off every single alarm inside of me. And here's what they were. Here's what the tells are. This person, I noticed that, XXXX. Right. This is what they were doing. They did this, and this. it wasn't just that I had a gut feeling. It was that my intuition was going off, and here's what triggered that intuition within me. So I think we need to have trained people, because there are people who have intuition and their intuition is right, but they can't articulate that. Right. If you can't articulate that, people are going to paint you as just this crazy oddball.
A feeling. Yeah. Right. Then you have nothing more than a feeling. But when you take that feeling, that alarm that goes off, and like you said, you can hang it on something concrete, then there you go.
Yeah. So I'll give an example, and, without using names, I'll close with this example because I think this was really important. There was a guy where there were credible allegations of abuse against a minor child. It was investigated. The investigation came to a close, and it was, I don't know if they used the word unfounded, but basically investigators acknowledged that something had happened, but they didn't have substantial evidence to allow the investigation to go further. So
Which
they said,
happens often.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I don't know if they determined it was founded or unfounded. And sometimes you'll have cases where they're founded, but the investigation comes to a close for whatever reason anyway. So here you have a guy who the entire time maintained his own innocence, which, surprise, surprise,
right.
They're always going to do. But the question is, on a practical level, how do we know whether he's telling the truth or not? Because at this point, you have his word against a family's word that something happened to their child. And so, when I looked at this a little bit further, what I found out was that this person had all the tells. And, at first he maintained his innocence. Then he played the victim. Well, that's another one of the tells.
Right.
He never came back and said, well, I want to figure out where this misunderstanding came from. That never was his approach. His approach was, how dare this family? How dare they try to wreck my name and wreck my reputation? Do you know how hard this has been on me and my family? He never tried to figure out whether there was a misunderstanding. So for me, that was important. That was an important indicator.
That's very huge.
The other thing, and as I explained this to these leaders, I said, here's what the pattern is almost inevitably with these people. First, they play the victim card and they play it hard. They maintain their innocence throughout. And then they reach a point where they get really nice and they crank it up almost superficially, where they're calling you sir and ma'am, and they're being more very polite than normal. Yes, absolutely. And they're nodding their heads and yep, so far you're nailing it. And I said, and then there comes a point where if you don't back down, if you continue to dig, if you continue to look, if you continue to ask questions, then they become combative. They move from super polite to super combative. And they'll come back and they'll go on the offensive. And they're gonna take the church down. They're gonna sue you for slander. They let their guard down.
There's a nastiness
and they become very, very combative.
Out. I'm thinking of a particular instance also with your dad. Very kind, calm, maintained his innocence throughout his investigation that he knew was happening until that moment when they knocked at the door and wanted his phone and computer. Then they saw a different person. He changed immediately, flashed those eyes, and said, absolutely not, get out of my place, get off of my property, and things changed. So there was that combative moment where it's like, no way, get out, get out.
Well, and the other thing too, I I don't know how much we talked about this before, but as a final FU to us, to the family, he had about a 3-week period where, from the time he was questioned till he was actually in handcuffs and went away, there was about a 3-week period where he was scot-free.
Oh yeah.
But he knew he was going to jail. Mm-hmm. They had told him, "You will be arrested." He knew it was coming. So he had plenty of time to clean out all the weird, sick garbage, paraphernalia, and all this stuff that was in his apartment that he knew that us brothers, me and my brothers, would be cleaning out. Yeah. He left everything. So when we went in that apartment, the stuff that we found, it was like, here I am.
It takes your breath away yet to think of that. But that's part of the tells too. That stuff remains there. It's not hidden.
No.
It's not.
And when they're caught, they don't destroy the evidence. No. They might destroy some of the evidence that will incriminate them. But as far as some of the stuff that, once the investigators have all the evidence that they need, these guys leave behind everything. And it's like they want people to know. And because they want to flaunt that.
Right.
It's not that they're like, oh, I'm going to be transparent. It's that this is exactly what I've been doing and you people didn't see it.
It's one final slap in the face.
Absolutely.
I think you said it. Yeah, one final there.
I mean, the stuff we found in his car, my wife and I had to clean his car out. It was unbelievable what he left behind in that car for us to find. I don't want to keep harping on
this, but there was a tell, but we were all too naive to know what that tell was. I was never permitted to drive his car. Mm-hmm. Even when my car was broken down and in such bad shape it shouldn't be on the road, I wasn't permitted because that was his office on wheels, he said. So even as his wife, there was that compartment of very, very close, what am I going to say, his personal stuff.
He guarded it.
Yeah.
He guarded his personal property.
And that's a tell that I didn't know.
Yeah.
I never opened the trunk of his car. I never did.
Yep.
But, and I had the key to the car. I just didn't do it.
Yeah.
So didn't mean to interject that. But these are
that's good.
These are what we're talking about. Things like this.
So I think in closing, it becomes really important, one, that we have the proper watchmen who are gifted at being watchmen, who have the gift of discernment, who aren't just overreactive, over-paranoid people, or the opposite of that, what you mentioned, the people who they think everybody has a good heart and, that
deserves a second chance.
Yeah, deserves a second chance. Yep.
Just slips up.
Those people can't be watchmen.
Right.
The people who think everybody's an abuser can't be watchmen. And you need watchmen who are discerning people, who have wisdom, and who know the tells of different types of abusers. Who are properly trained.
Right.
And who are going to inform people immediately.
Absolutely.
When they know. So we'll leave it there. We'll come back eventually in a podcast in the near future, and I'll talk about some of those tells because that's important. Those are different than red flag behaviors.
I think that's more important than just saying that's important. That is vital.
Absolutely.
That's
make or break.
Vital that you come back to that point of sharing some of the tells with others.
Yeah. So, truth bomb. We need to hand select who the watchmen are who keep watch within our organizations, within our homes, and we need to lean on them, and we need to utilize them to the safety of all people. Thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you next episode. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.